please. Just make it quick.
Sold lot 27 to the man in the hat.
Please, just make it quick, she whispered. The next 5 seconds changed her forever. In 1883, in a parched town named Blackwood, the air was thick with the smell of dust and despair. But it was the silent helplessness in a young woman's eyes that truly captured the town's attention. The sun was setting, hanging low over the desolate hills, painting the sky red and scorching the skin of the men gathered in the square. The auctioneer's dry, rasping calls cut through the air, but the most terrifying sound was the hushed, murmuring and gossip of the crowd. They circled a rickety wooden block where a young girl stood. She was lot 27, a name no more than a soulless number. She wore a tattered dress, her bare feet were caked with dirt, and her hands were bound with a rough rope. Her eyes, a pale blue like a stormy sky, stared down at the ground, where specks of dust swirled and vanished. Shame and fear crawled through the air. She felt her skin burning, not from the sun, but from the scrutiny of lifeless eyes and mocking laughter. Perhaps she once had a name, a family, but now all of it had turned to dust. She had once prayed, but her God had died along with her family. The loud laughter of a bearded man, the whispers of women covering their mouths, the shuffling of feet, a dry cough, all created a chaotic symphony, and she only wished to disappear. The stinging sun was unrelenting, beads of sweat trickling down her back, the rhythmic thud of a wooden gavel scraping at her flesh. Bowing her head, bowing it low, she prayed for the auction to end soon. No matter who, no matter the price, as long as she was no longer the hollow lot 27. The pace of the story was slow and heavy, focusing on Alara's suffering and despair. She had no voice, no acts of defiance. She was just a shadow, a commodity being auctioned. Beside her stood a man in a sharp suit, a small figure whose eyes were full of power and greed. Judge Orrin Crow. He smirked, uttering condescending words about Alara, his voice dripping with mockery and malice. He looked at Alara as if she were an object, a possession, something worthless. He didn't care about her. He only cared about the debt she had to repay. Physical pain, emotional pain, she had become all too familiar with it. A tall, broad-shouldered man leaned against a rotting wooden post on the edge of the square. His face was weathered by the sun, his eyes resolute, looking directly at Alara. His name was Jebediah Stone. His eyes held a deep and unnameable sadness, a pain that had been buried for a long time but was now resurfacing vividly. He wasn't from this town. He lived alone on a distant ranch where the wind blew dust every afternoon. He wasn't a man of many words. He was a man of action, and his actions often came from sudden impulses, from old pains, and from a sense of atonement that he believed he had to make. Jebediah didn't bid immediately. He watched in silence. He saw the despair in Alara's eyes, and it brought back another image, another pain, the pain of his late wife. She, too, had once had those desperate eyes when he didn't have enough money to pay the doctor. That pain had carved itself deep into his heart and become a part of him. It had built an invisible wall between him and the world, a wall he once thought could never be broken. But now, Alara's eyes had shattered that wall. He felt a strong urge, an urge to act. The auctioneer's calls continued, and Jebediah Stone stepped forward. He had no money. He only had one thing, a single raw nugget. It was a memento of his wife, a priceless item. He held it up. The crowd was astonished, and Orrin Crow was enraged. He yelled, "That's not money. That's an illegal item." Jebediah said nothing. He just looked straight at Orrin Crow, his eyes full of defiance and determination. "Sold or not sold?" the auctioneer asked. Orrin Crow was furious, but he could do nothing. He had been publicly humiliated by Jebediah Stone. The auctioneer brought the gavel down. "Sold to the man in the hat." The auctioneer's voice rang out like a thunderclap. Alara looked up and saw Jebediah Stone, the man who had saved her. He was not a handsome man. He was just an ordinary man with sad eyes. He didn't say a word, just took a woolen shawl from his saddlebag and gently draped it over her shoulders. The rough fabric offered a surprising warmth against her sunburned skin. It was the first time in a long while that she had felt a gentle touch without an intent to harm. They rode off in silence, with only the creaking of the saddle and the whispering of the wind. Ilara sat behind Jebediah, and she didn't say a word. She just looked at his broad back. She felt the warmth from the woolen shawl, and she felt a safety she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt alive, something she once thought she would never feel again. The horse's steady footsteps were a constant, rhythmic beat. Every blade of grass, every stone, all became vibrant in her eyes. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he wanted. But she trusted him. She believed he wouldn't harm her. Ilara gazed at the hills, where the sun had fully set, as if staring into a world that had crumbled. The pain was a thorn, still there, piercing her heart. She had prayed for the auction to end quickly, no matter who, no matter the price. She just wanted it to be over fast. Her family's debt was too great, and they had sold her. She wasn't a person. She was just a commodity. She raised her hands, looking at the calloused marks on her palms, as if they were living proof of a life that had been sold. She had thought it would be better to die than to live a life as a commodity, without a name, without a choice. The first buyer was a baker, a round-bellied man with flour dusting his apron. He seemed kind enough, with a booming laugh and a smile that reached his eyes. Ilara, then known simply as the girl, was put to work in his bustling bakery. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and sugar, a far cry from the dust and desperation of her old life. For a while, she thought she had found a tolerable existence. She kneaded dough until her arms ached, shaped loaves of bread, and scrubbed the floors until they gleamed. The work was hard, but it was honest. But the baker's kindness had a price. It was in the way his hand lingered on her back as he showed her how to flour a pan, in the way he'd call her to the back room for extra help after his wife had gone to bed. He never forced her, not with his hands. The force was in his position, in the unspoken threat of what would happen if she refused. His wife, a thin-lipped woman with eyes as cold as river stones, saw everything but chose to see nothing. She would look right through Ilara, her gaze sweeping past her as if she were a ghost, a piece of furniture, anything but a person. She buried her head in a worn Bible, its pages filled with prayers for her husband's soul, never once considering the girl's. Ilara felt a deep, chilling despair. She was trapped in a gilded cage, a piece of property passed between silent complicity and feigned ignorance. The sweet smell of the bakery now felt cloying, suffocating her with every breath. The baker's debt grew, and Ilara was once again on the block. The next owner was a blacksmith, a hulking man with arms like tree trunks and a face perpetually smudged with soot. In his forge, the heat was a living thing, a roaring beast that consumed the air. The clang of the hammer against the anvil was a constant, deafening rhythm that vibrated through her bones. The blacksmith's wife, a stern and formidable woman, kept a sharp eye on her husband and on Ilara. She was not a kind woman, but she was fair in her own way. She assigned Ilara to the dirtiest, most menial tasks, hauling water, mending clothes, and tending to the garden. She treated her like a servant, a tool, but at least she was a tool with clear boundaries. But the blacksmith was a man of rough appetites. He was not as subtle as the baker. His touches were not lingering. They were grabs, pinches, a hand that would stray when his wife was not looking. He would leer at her, his eyes stripping her bare, and she would feel her skin crawl with a cold dread. The wife, preoccupied with her own children and the endless chores of the household, was oblivious. Or perhaps she, like the baker's wife, had simply learned to look away. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Ilara was left alone with the blacksmith in the forge. He cornered her, his body a wall of muscle and heat, his breath smelling of ale. "Don't you worry, little bird," he grunted, his fingers digging into her arm. "I'll take good care of you." Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. She fought back, not with a scream, but with a silent, desperate struggle. She bit his hand, a sharp, angry protest that took him by surprise. He roared in pain and pushed her away, his rage a tangible thing. The next morning, she was sold again, this time for a pittance, her value diminished by her perceived defiance. Her next master was a man of God, a priest with a booming voice and a kind face. Ilara, now known as Sarah, a name given by the priest's wife in an attempt at redemption, thought she had finally found a safe haven. The priest's home was quiet, filled with books and the scent of beeswax. She was tasked with cleaning the rectory, dusting the pews, and preparing meals. The priest's wife, a woman with soft, sad eyes and a perpetually worried expression, treated her with a fragile kindness. She would sometimes talk to Ilara, asking about her past with a gentle curiosity. Ilara never told her the truth, never spoke of the baker or the blacksmith. The words would have felt like an ugliness she couldn't bring into this pristine home. The priest's wife would hug her Bible to her chest, as if it were a shield against the world, and Ilara often wondered what sins she was praying for. But even in this house of God, Ilara was not safe. The priest, a man who preached of salvation and forgiveness, had his own demons. He would watch her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He would accidentally touch her in the narrow hallways, his hand brushing against hers, his fingers lingering. He would pull her into his study, his voice low and intimate, to talk about the Lord. But his eyes told a different story. He never touched her in a truly violent way, but his constant, predatory presence was a torment in itself. His wife, the quiet, prayerful woman, knew. Ilara saw it in the way she would clutch her Bible tighter when her husband's gaze lingered on her, in the way her eyes would dart between them, filled with a silent, agonizing terror. She would tell herself that she was helpless, that her husband's position in the town made him untouchable. But what she really was complicit. She was silent, and her silence was as sharp as any blade. It was a suffocating hypocrisy that made Ilara feel more alone than ever. The priest, driven by a deep-seated guilt or a fear of exposure, eventually sold her. This time, she was not sold in a town. She was sold to a traveling merchant, a quiet, somber man with a wagon full of goods. She was no longer a person with a name, but a piece of merchandise, a piece of flesh to be traded for a few coins. She was nothing more than a ghost, a shadow of a girl who had once had a home and a family. The constant fear, the endless work, the dehumanization, it all chipped away at her, leaving behind an empty shell. She had learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing. She had learned to be a commodity, to be a thing. When the merchant came to sell her, she didn't look up. She didn't pray. She just stood there, her hands raw and calloused, waiting for the inevitable. The buyer was a man named Jebediah. He was tall, quiet, with eyes that held a deep, unreadable sadness. He didn't look at her like a piece of property, he just looked at her. And in that look, something shifted. A tiny flicker of hope, a fragile, trembling thing, began to stir in the desolate ruins of her heart. Arriving at the ranch, Ilara was led into a small, clean room. She clutched the shawl, the only proof of a change she couldn't yet comprehend. It was an old shawl, but it brought her a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked into an old mirror and saw herself. She wasn't a beautiful girl, but she was no longer the soulless Lot 27. She was Ilara. She was a human being. She had been saved. The physical pain was still there, but the emotional pain had lessened. She felt a sense of peace. She felt a sense of hope. She felt alive. She knew this was a new beginning. She had been saved by a man with a raw nugget and an old shawl. She had been saved by a man with sad eyes and a heart full of compassion. The next day, Ilara woke up. The smell of wood smoke and freshly brewed coffee was a shock to her senses. It was the smell of life, the smell of peace. She went outside and saw Jebediah Stone. He was repairing an old fence. He said nothing, just pointed to a plate of biscuits and a cup of coffee on the table. She ate slowly, deliberately, but she felt a warmth in her stomach. She felt alive. She felt hope. She felt peace. She knew this was a new beginning. She had been saved. Jebediah said nothing. He just watched. He saw the change in Ilara's eyes. He saw life, something he once thought he would never see again. He saw hope. He saw peace. He felt happy. He had saved someone. He had saved himself. Ilara explored Jebediah Stone's house. It was a simple home, but it was full of memories. She saw old photographs, old items, and she understood that he had once had a family. She understood that he had once had love. She understood that he had once been happy. She felt empathy. She felt his pain. She felt his loneliness. She knew that he was just like her, a person who had once lost everything. They didn't talk much. They just worked. They fed the chickens, checked the fences, cared for a newborn colt. Ilara, who was only used to heavy labor, found a gentle purpose in caring for a small, fragile creature. She felt the warmth of the colt's fur, its gentle nuzzling. She felt alive, something she once thought she would never feel again. Jebediah Stone continued to repair the old fence. He worked hard, with patience. He didn't say anything, he just did. He wasn't a man of many words, he was a man of action. And his actions often came from sudden impulses, from old pains, and from a sense of atonement that he believed he had to make. He believed he could fix the old fence, and he believed he could fix his life. He believed he could fix the mistakes of the past. They sat together on the porch, looking at the distant hills. The sun had set, and the sky was a canvas of orange and purple. The air was cool, and the smell of evening dew mixed with the scent of pine. Ilara asked Jebediah Stone, "What was that stone for?" Jebediah Stone said nothing. He just looked at the stone and remembered his wife. He remembered their beautiful memories. He remembered the promises they had made to each other. He remembered the dreams they had once shared. Ilara had touched a wound she didn't know he was carrying. She felt a deep sadness. She felt his loneliness. She felt his helplessness. She knew that he was just like her, a person who had once lost everything. She felt empathy. She felt his pain. She felt his loneliness. The long shadow cast against the sunset wasn't a friendly guest, but a reminder that the cruel world hadn't let them go. The sound of hooves grew closer, clearer, like a drum beating in Ilara's heart. She squeezed Jebediah's hand, feeling the anxiety rising within her. But she also felt his resolve. He wasn't afraid. He just stood there, facing the enemy. The faint light from the lantern on the porch illuminated the three figures approaching the front yard. Leading them was Orrin Crow, the vicious judge with a smug smile. He wore an expensive suit, but his eyes were full of greed and malice. His two henchmen, two burly men, followed behind, their eyes full of menace. He made no secret of his intentions. He had come to reclaim Ilara, viewing her as stolen property. "Evening, Stone," Orrin Crow said, his voice mocking and contemptuous. "I thought you'd be hiding out here forever, but I was wrong. You're not hiding. You're just a fool. You think that raw nugget can buy a human being. You've broken the law, and she is still our debt." Ilara trembled. The old fear rose within her. She remembered his harsh words, the soulless eyes of the crowd, the feeling of despair standing on the auction block. She wanted to run, to hide in a corner, but she couldn't. She squeezed Jebediah's hand, and he squeezed hers back. He said nothing, but his actions said it all. He would protect her. Jebediah Stone did not back down. He stepped forward, shielding Ilara. He held an axe in his hand, not to threaten, but to show his integrity and determination. "I didn't buy her," Jebediah said, his voice deep and full of weight. "I was just a bidder for her freedom. I gave her back the things that men like you took away. Her name, her choice, and her dignity." Orrin Crow was furious. He pulled a small dagger from his belt and moved threateningly toward Jebediah. "You've said enough, Stone," he yelled. "You will pay for your foolishness." Ilara trembled, but she gripped a small stone in her hand, ready to fight. She was no longer a weak girl. She had become stronger. Jebediah did not back down. He raised the axe, not to attack, but to defend. He looked straight into Orrin Crow's eyes, his own eyes full of resolve and courage. "I am not afraid of you," Jebediah said, his voice heavy, like a declaration. "You can take the money back, you can take the nugget back, but you cannot take her freedom. Her freedom is not a commodity, it is a right." Orrin Crow faltered it. He had not expected such words from a simple man like Jebediah. He looked into Alara's fiery eyes, and he understood that she was no longer a weak person. He looked at Jebediah's axe, and he understood that he would not back down. He gave a weak laugh, a laugh full of contempt. "This isn't over, Stone," he said, then turned and rode away, leaving a lingering threat in the air. Orin Crow's threat did not scare them. It only made them stronger. They knew they would have to face more challenges. But they were no longer alone. They had each other. They had love. They had a life. They had a future. Ilara woke up in an incredible silence. The harsh sun of Blackwood had given way to the gentle light of early morning, filtering through the small window and casting long streaks on the clean wooden floor. The smell of wood smoke from the old fireplace mingled with the scent of fresh pine and the dampness of the earth after a night of dew. It was a strange smell, not the smell of sweat, dust, or fear. It was the smell of a home. She lay still on the bed, feeling the rough but clean fabric of the sheet, listening to the chirping of birds outside the window, a sound she hadn't heard in so long. Her heart was still beating fast, but it was no longer a frantic rhythm. It beat with a cautious skepticism. She wondered if it was all a beautiful dream, a sophisticated deception, before being pushed into another hell. With the wariness of a small, wounded animal, Ilara slid out of bed. Her entire body still ached, every muscle seeming to resist this sudden freedom. She pulled Jeb's shawl closer, its scent of him, of wood and earth, giving her a little bit of safety. The door to the room was unlocked. This disoriented her. During her time in captivity, the door had always been a harsh boundary, a declaration of her lack of freedom. Now, that boundary had disappeared. She stood at the threshold, taking a deep breath. The vast space of the house appeared before her. A simple wooden table was in the middle of the room, on it a plate of biscuits and a cup of cold coffee. She walked barefoot on the floor, moving as lightly as a shadow. She saw old items, a few faded pictures on the wall, a wooden shelf filled with books. All were neat and clean, with a sorrowful beauty. It was the beauty of a person who once had everything but now only had fragments of memories. Her eyes stopped on a small, intricately carved wooden box. On it was a raw nugget. It was not a sparkling gem, but an ordinary stone, with natural cracks and veins. But she knew this was the stone Jebediah Stone had used to buy her. She reached out and lightly touched it, feeling its roughness and coldness, but also feeling a strange warmth. That stone was not meant to buy a person. It was a priceless item, a symbol of sacrifice and compassion. Outside the window, an image had caught her eye. Jebediah Stone was standing by the fence, with an axe in his hand. He didn't swing the axe wildly, but slowly, carefully, as if he wasn't chopping wood, but mending something. Each swing of the axe he brought down on a new piece of wood created a deep, steady sound. It was not the sound of anger, but the rhythm of patience. Ilara stood watching him in silence, realizing that this man was not just repairing a fence, he was mending a rotted life, just as he had saved her. They didn't speak, only communicated with small gestures. When Jebediah came back inside, he didn't look at her, simply placed a hot cup of coffee on the table. He sat down in the chair opposite her, not eating or drinking, just looking out the window. The silence between them was not awkward, but a space for both of them to reflect and feel. Ilara, after a moment's hesitation, took a biscuit. It was a small act, but full of weight. It was the first act of trust, a nod to the kindness she never thought she would receive. The biscuit was crispy, and its gentle sweetness spread in her mouth, chasing away the bitter taste of fear. Then, Jebediah took her outside. It wasn't for hard labor, but to care for a newborn foal. The tiny, wobbly creature stood unsteadily beside its mother. Ilara reached out and gently stroked its soft coat. She felt warmth, life something she had thought she'd never feel again. Her fear began to melt away, replaced by empathy and compassion. She looked at the foal and saw herself, a fragile creature trying to survive in a harsh world. Ilara and Jebediah worked together in a wordless harmony. He guided her with gestures, and she understood. She learned to feed the horses, clean the stalls, and care for the foal. She felt peace. She felt life. She felt hope. She knew this was a new beginning. She had been saved by a man with a rough-cut jewel and an old shawl. She had been saved by a man with eyes full of sorrow and a heart full of love. One afternoon, while she was brushing the foal, she saw Jebediah standing by the fence, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He seemed lost in another world, a world of pain and memories. Ilara felt a strong urge. She couldn't bear the silence anymore. She needed to know the truth. She needed to know why he had saved her. She needed to know why he had used something so valuable to buy someone as worthless as her. That stone, what was it for? Ilara asked, her voice trembling but full of determination. It was the first real question she had asked since the day she was saved. Jebediah Stone stopped, his hand still resting on the cracked wood, his face turned away. Her question had touched a wound she didn't know he carried. The peaceful look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep sadness. Jebediah sighed, a heavy, weighted sound. He looked at his rough hands, his fingers clenching as if trying to hold on to something invisible. That gem, it was my wife's, he began, his voice low and hoarse, like burning wood in a fireplace. Her name was Sarah. She found it out here, on that hill. She loved it, said it didn't sparkle like a diamond, but it had a genuine beauty, just like our life. Ilara listened, unblinking. She pictured a woman with a warm smile, a woman with a genuine love for a man who was once happy. The pain in Jebediah's voice wasn't a fresh wound, but the ache of an old scar that still throbbed sometime. He continued, his voice growing weaker. One day, she got a fever. I went for a doctor, but the town was too far, and I didn't have enough money. I ran like a madman, but by the time I got back, it was too late. He stopped, bowing his head, his shoulders shaking. She died in my arms, and I couldn't do anything. I let her go. Ilara clenched her hands. She understood that feeling, the profound helplessness, the guilt of not being able to save someone you loved. She felt Jebediah's pain, the pain of a man who had lost everything. She felt his loneliness, the loneliness of a man consumed by the past. She looked at the rough gem on the table, and now it was no longer a lifeless object, but a symbol of love, of pain, and of regret. Ilara looked up at the night sky, a memory from long ago suddenly rushing back, a memory from when she was a child, and the world was still full of bright colors. When I was little, she said softly, her voice like the wind, my mother used to say I'd marry the kindest man in the world, that he would pay a ton of gold and silver for me, and I would live a happy life. She paused, a bitter smile on her face. She was half right. You're the kindest man in the world, but you only paid with one rough stone. Ilara turned to look at Jeb, a glint of light in her eyes. She let out a small, fragile, but genuine laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but a laugh of release, of acceptance. Jebediah looked at her, and he smiled too. He didn't say anything, but he understood. He understood the bitterness in her words, and he also understood the relief of being able to say them. His deep, warm laugh echoed in the quiet space, blending with hers to create a wondrous symphony. Jebediah's eyes didn't just see Ilara. They saw through the dusty haze of the past, seeing a glimmer of light in her. In the soft glow of the stars, his eyes were no longer the sorrow of a man who had lost everything, but the tenderness of a man who had found hope. His gaze held no possession, but respect, admiration. He looked at her, not as a possession, but as a star that had fallen from the sky, twinkling in the darkness of his life. His eyes were like a warm stream, washing away the scars in her soul, bringing her a peace she never thought she'd have. In that moment, there were no words, no turmoil, just two souls that had found healing at each other. One clear morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm, breaking the fragile peace that had begun to blossom. It was a gaunt and weary old man who introduced himself as Ilara's distant great-uncle. He said he had been searching for her for a long time, that her family had paid off their debts and were worried about her and wanted her to come home to be cared for. Instead of living a hard life in this desolate place, they had always been tormented by the decision to sell her. The uncle's eyes were full of pity and concern. "You don't belong here, Ilara," he said, his tone gentle but persuasive. "You're a woman raised with comfort, not to live the life of a farmer's wife. Come home, you'll be taken care of. You won't have to do any heavy work. I promise I'll look after you." Ilara looked toward Jebediah. He stood there, silent as always, but she could feel a deep helplessness in his eyes. He didn't say a word to make her stay, because he believed she had the right to choose. He had given her freedom, and he didn't want to take it away by forcing her to stay. A fierce internal struggle took place within Ilara. On one side was the security, the stability she had long lost. On the other was a man who had saved her, who had given her back her dignity, but couldn't promise a certain future. She struggled immensely, and finally, she made a decision. "I'll go with you, Uncle," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "But I want to say goodbye to Jebediah, to say my farewells." The farewell was a painful silence. Ilara didn't dare to look him in the eyes. She only looked down at the ground, where specks of dust swirled and disappeared. He said nothing, just took a shawl from his saddlebag and draped it over her shoulders. This shawl, which he had first put on her to save her from shame, now served as a parting full of regret. She couldn't hold back the tears, which streamed down her cheeks, falling onto the shawl. She rode away, and never once looked back. Jebediah stood there, watching her silhouette disappear over the hills. He didn't say a word, but the pain in his eyes said it all. Once again, he had lost someone. In the days after Ilara left, Jebediah's farm was shrouded in a heavy silence. It wasn't the familiar quiet of a man living alone, but the emptiness of a home that had once held laughter. The fragrant smell of coffee was gone, replaced by the ghost of empty cups. The chair on the porch, where Ilara used to sit, was now a painful reminder of a void that couldn't be filled. Jebediah's sorrow wasn't the grief of an ordinary man, but the sadness of arid land that had once been watered by rain, but now faced a drought. His heart, like that land, had once sprouted hope, but now was left with deep cracks, waiting for a rain he knew would never come. He didn't just lose a person, he lost a part of himself. Loneliness returned, not as an old friend, but as a defeated enemy now returning to claim its final victory. He tried to convince himself that it was a good thing, that she had gone back to her family, to a better life, that he had done the right thing. But every time he sat on the porch, looking at the horizon, he saw the image of the girl who used to sit there, telling small stories, who used to laugh when he talked about how slow he was. His sadness wasn't the sadness of loss, but the sadness of emptiness, of a future that had once begun to bloom but was now gone. His pain wasn't the pain of separation, but the pain of loneliness that had returned. His heart, after all those days of warmth, was now cold again. One quiet afternoon, Jebediah rode back to the farm. The setting sun painted the sky crimson, but his heart was only gray. He dismounted and walked heavily toward the house. His steps were heavier than ever, as if he were carrying a boulder on his shoulders. He opened the door, and a familiar scent hit him, a scent he thought he would never smell again. The smell of boiling water on the stove, and the fragrant aroma of corn soup. He froze, his heart pounded, a rhythm he thought he would never feel again. The scent wasn't just the smell of soup, but the smell of life, the smell of hope. He stepped inside and saw her, Ilara, standing at the stove, her back to him. Her small back was no longer frail, but resilient. He stood there, not saying a word, just watching her. Ilara turned, and she saw him, her face flushed, her eyes sparkling like stars. She said nothing, just lowered her head, nervously picking at the hem of her dress. Fear had returned to her eyes, but this time it wasn't the fear of despair, but the fear of rejection. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice trembling but full of determination. "I went back to see my parents," she said, "and I told them that I have my own small home, a place where I belong, a place where I am loved and respected." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. Will you accept me? Will you accept a woman who was once sold?" Jebediah said nothing. He walked over to her, his eyes no longer sad, but full of tenderness and love. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't a diamond ring, but a simple silver one, Yet it was a promise of a future of love and happiness. "I was going to give it to you," he said, his voice warm and gentle, "but I wasn't sure if you truly wanted it. I didn't want to force you, didn't want to take away your freedom." Elara looked at the ring, and tears began to flow. She couldn't control her emotions. She looked into his eyes and saw love, respect, tenderness. She saw a man who had saved her, who had given her back her dignity, and now was giving her love. She took his hand and said, "I want it. I want it." She didn't just want the ring, she wanted him, his love, his life. He said no more words. He just took Elara's hand, slowly slipped the silver ring onto her finger, and gently adjusted it to fit. She softly closed her hand, the silver ring sparkling under the weak yellow light like a small star that had found its place. That evening, only a cool breeze caressed her cheeks. She pressed her lips together, tasting the salt of tears that had fallen without her realizing. He silently held her in his arms, a wordless embrace, but it was full of every promise. In that moment, there was no more emptiness, no more pain, only the peace of two souls that had found each other. In the days that followed, Jebediah's farm changed. His world was filled with Elara's clear laughter, a sound he had thought he would never hear again. The wildflowers, which were once lifeless decorations on the old fence, now seemed to be watered by her happiness, blooming with a powerful vitality. Their fence was not just the boundary of a piece of land, but the border of their own new world. Elara had grown used to having his broad shoulder whenever they sat on the porch together, looking out at the distant hills. When Jebediah worked, she would often stand from afar and look at his large back. It made her heart feel warm and tender. Elara stood at the fence where Jebediah was carefully making repairs. She looked out at the red dirt road, scarred with old wagon tracks. The wind blew, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust, and something else, a bitter and heartbreakingly familiar scent, the smell of desperation. From a distance, a small figure gradually appeared. As they got closer, Elara could see more clearly. A young woman, with disheveled hair, hollow eyes, and a stumbling gait from exhaustion. In her arms was a small child, curled up in a thin blanket, its tiny face covered in dirt. The child's skin was pale, its lips cracked, and it was sleeping soundly in its mother's arms. But even in sleep, its small hands clutched the mother's torn shirt, a last desperate grasp at life. The woman's eyes met Elara's. It wasn't a pleading look, but an empty one, filled with helplessness and humiliation. Elara saw herself in those eyes, the image of a girl who had once stood on an auction block, not daring to look up, only wanting to disappear. She saw the pain of a mother who couldn't protect her child, the pain of a woman who had lost everything. The woman stopped at the gate, not daring to enter. It seemed she believed that the gate was the boundary between two worlds, a world she had been left behind in, and a world she had no right to enter. The hardship was etched deep into her face, from the sunburn on her cheeks, to her calloused hands, to the tired lines on her forehead. The child was still asleep, a restless sleep. Elara stepped out, not saying a word. She had once been in that position, where no words could express the pain and despair. She reached out and gently placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. Her eyes were gentle, full of understanding. Then, with a decisive action, she opened the old wooden gate. "Come in," she said, her voice warm and full of compassion. "You're safe here." The gate opened, not just as an entrance, but as a promise that, in a harsh world, there were still people willing to reach out, willing to share kindness and compassion. It was in that moment that Elara realized her healing wasn't just for herself, but a torch to light hope for others, for those who had been left behind. This is a Wild West love story, one of the best Wild West stories you can find. A love story between a lonely cowboy and a broken woman. A Western love story about healing, hope, and resilience. A Western story about courage, integrity, and the fight for freedom.